I was part of the elite Delta Force team that breached the presidential palace in Caracas at 2 a.m., snatching Nicolás Maduro and his wife from their beds in a mission that effectively declared war on Venezuelan sovereignty and rewrote the rules of global power. The vibration of the CH-47 Chinook hummed through my bones, a rhythmic, violent thrumming that matched the pounding in my chest. We were flying black, no lights, no transponders, just 30 elite operators sitting in a dark metal tube, hurtling through the humid Venezuelan night at 200 feet above the treetops. I looked down at my gloved hands, gripping the rail of my HK-416. My knuckles were white. I'd been on hits in Tora Bora and high-stakes extractions in the Horn of Africa, but this wasn't a raid on a compound of cave-dwelling insurgents. This was Operation Absolute Resolve. We were about to breach the residence of a sitting head of state. The air inside the bird was thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and the ozone of high-end electronics. Across from me, Miller, our lead breacher, caught my eye through his panoramic night vision goggles. He gave a sharp single nod. There was no chatter. We didn't need it. We had run this mission 1,000 times on a plywood and concrete mock-up in the North Carolina woods until we could navigate every hallway of the Fuerte Tiuna military complex blindfolded. But the mock-up didn't have the weight of history behind it. 5 mics. The pilot's voice crackled over the comms, cold and professional. Outside the open ramp, the landscape was a blur of dark green jungle transitioning into the sprawling, flickering lights of Caracas. It looked peaceful from up here, a city of millions sleeping, unaware that in exactly 300 seconds, their world was going to tilt on its axis. We weren't just here to arrest a man, we were here to dismantle a regime.
The legal justification was narco-terrorism and a litany of federal indictments out of the Southern District of New York. But as I adjusted the chin strap of my Ops Corps helmet, I knew the reality was much heavier. We were the tip of a spear that was about to be driven into the heart of a nation. The plan was surgical. While the world watched the headlines about diplomatic tensions, we were the physical manifestation of a total breakdown in diplomacy. The mission was absolute. Extract Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores. No alternatives, no if possible. The orders came from the very top, bypassing the usual layers of deniability. If we succeeded, we'd be ghosts in a geopolitical storm. If we failed, we'd be the spark that lit a third world war. I checked my primary optic one last time. The red dot was steady. Around us, the sky was silent, but I knew it was crowded. Somewhere above us, F-22s were prowling the stratosphere, their radar scrubbing the Venezuelan sky for any sign of a scramble. EA-18G growlers were already beginning their electronic feast, vomiting out white noise that would turn every Venezuelan air defense radar into a screen of static. 2 mics, prepare for fast rope. We stood up in unison, a choreographed movement of suppressed weaponry in heavy gear. The wind whipped into the cabin, smelling of salt water and tropical heat. I felt the Chinook flare, the nose pitching up as the pilots bled off speed over the target coordinates. The Fuerte Tiuna complex loomed below, a fortress within a city, supposedly the most secure location in the country. To us, it was just a puzzle we had already solved. The ropes dropped. I was third man down. As my boots hit the roof of the presidential residence, the silence of the night was shattered by the first controlled detonations. The breach had begun. There was no going back.
In that moment, as the first flashbang turned the world white, I realized that by the time the sun rose, the map of the world would never look the same again. We were inside. We were the storm. To understand how we ended up on that rooftop, you have to understand the months of silence and shadow that preceded the noise. This wasn't a snap decision made in a weekend. It was the culmination of Operation Southern Spear, a slow-motion tightening of the noose that we had been living and breathing for half a year. Before the first shot was fired, we were already ghosts in the system. Back at Fort Bragg, the atmosphere had shifted months ago. We stopped being sent on the usual counterinsurgency rotations. Instead, they built a ghost city. They used satellite imagery and LiDAR data to reconstruct a 1-to-1 scale replica of the Fuerte Tiuna military complex. We lived in that replica. I knew the exact height of the curbs, the swing of the reinforced steel doors, and the blind spots of every security camera in the Venezuelan president's private quarters. We were obsessed. We had to be. The strategy was built on the back of total air and electronic superiority. We weren't just going in with a few teams. We had the full weight of the U.S. military's invisible hand behind us. Over 150 aircraft were mobilized under various guises of training exercises in the Caribbean.
I remember walking the flight line at an undisclosed base, watching the F-22s and F-35s being prepped in the pre-dawn light. They weren't carrying training rounds. They were loaded for bear. The intelligence was coming in through RQ-170 Sentinel drones, the Wraiths. They hovered over Caracas for weeks undetected, feeding us high-definition thermal loops of Maduro's movements. We knew when he ate, when he slept, and who stayed in the room with him. We saw the Cuban advisors moving like shadows in the background, the elite Praetorian Guard that actually held the keys to his safety.
My team's job was to be the scalpel that cut through that guard before they even knew the operating room was open. At the time, I believed in the purity of the mission. We were briefed on the narco-terrorism charges, the cartel of the Suns. We were told we were stopping a criminal enterprise that was destabilizing the entire hemisphere. There was a sense of righteous intensity in the hangar. We saw ourselves as the ultimate enforcers of justice, reaching across borders to grab a man who thought he was untouchable. I'd spent my career believing that we were the line between order and chaos. I remember a briefing 3 weeks before the jump. A high-ranking official from the agency stood in front of a digital map of the Venezuelan oil belt. He didn't talk about democracy or human rights. He talked about stability and regional security. I dismissed the coldness of his tone as typical bureaucratic pragmatism. I was focused on the tactical, the extraction, the suppressive fire, the fast rope durations. I had a wife and daughter at home who thought I was doing advanced maneuvers in Florida. I missed sacrifices, missed birthdays, and lived in a state of constant physical exhaustion, all for the sake of this one perfect strike. We were told the Venezuelan people would see us as liberators, or at least they wouldn't see us at all until it was over. We were promised that the electronic warfare would be so absolute that we'd be in and out before a single distress signal could reach the regular army barracks. We placed our blind trust in the intelligence, in the technology, and in the mission's moral clarity. As we moved from the staging area to the carrier, the scale of the buildup was staggering. Seeing the sheer number of EA-18G growlers ready to blind an entire nation's sensors gave me a sense of invincibility. We were the masters of the sky and the shadows. We had every tool, every advantage, and a cause we believed was just. We were ready to do the impossible.
We were ready to take a president. The transition from the simulated world of the training compound to the visceral reality of Fuerte Tiuna was instantaneous and violent. As soon as my boots hit the roof, the surgical nature of the mission began to bleed into something far more chaotic. The air was ripped apart by the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of flashbangs and the sharp, clinical barks of suppressed fire. We moved like a single organism, a lethal tide of multicam and matte black gear. But the resistance we met wasn't the disorganized panic we had been told to expect. "Contact! 6 o'clock! 3rd floor balcony!" Miller's voice was a calm rasp over the comms, punctuated by the double tap of his rifle. We weren't just fighting Venezuelan soldiers. We realized it the moment we saw their movement patterns, tight, disciplined, and aggressive. These were Cuban specialists, the elite advisors embedded deep within Maduro's security apparatus. They didn't retreat, they dug in. The hallways became a claustrophobic nightmare of smoke and muzzle flashes. My world narrowed down to the green-tinted circle of my night vision and the 3 feet of space directly in front of me. "Move! Move! Clear left!" I kicked in a heavy mahogany door and the room exploded in splinters. A guard lunged from behind a desk, his face a mask of desperation. I didn't think, I reacted. 2 rounds to the chest, 1 to the head. He fell, and I was already pivoting to the next corner. The speed was the only thing keeping us alive, but the invisible cloak we were supposed to be wearing was shredding. The electronic warfare was working, mostly. Outside, the city was dark, the power grids intentionally tripped to sow confusion. But inside the compound, the backup generators kicked in, bathing the corridors in a sickly, flickering emergency red. It was a hellscape.
The screams of the wounded and the shouting in Spanish echoed through the marble halls, mixing with the heavy scent of spent cordite and expensive floor wax. "Status check. Team Alpha?" The command center crackled in my ear. They were watching from thousands of miles away via the helmet cams, seeing the carnage in high definition. "We're heavy in the soup," I replied, pressing my back against a cold stone pillar as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the wall beside me. Resistance is higher than briefed. Multiple Cuban personnel confirmed, pushing to the primary objective. The gaslighting of our briefings began to itch at the back of my mind. We were told the guard would fold. We were told they were demoralized. Instead, they were fighting like they had everything to lose. Every room was a battle. Every staircase was a choke point.
I watched one of my teammates, a guy I'd shared a beer with 48 hours ago, catch a ricochet to the shoulder. He didn't scream. He just gritted his teeth and kept his weapon up, but the blood soaking through his sleeve was real. We finally reached the heavy, reinforced doors of the presidential suite. This was the moment. We set the charges, the silent countdown ticking in our heads. 3, 2, 1. The blast blew the doors inward. We surged through the smoke. I saw him first, Maduro, standing in the center of the room, his face pale and sweating under the dim lights, his hands half raised. Beside him, Celia Flores was screaming, a sound that cut through the ringing in my ears. They weren't the caricatures from the news. They were just people, terrified and cornered. "Target secured. We have the HVT," Miller shouted. We had them in custody in under 30 minutes, just as planned. But as we began the frantic push back to the extraction point, the cost was becoming undeniable. The hallways we had just cleared were littered with bodies.
Some were in uniform, but others were officials in suits, caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't know was coming. The surgical strike had turned into a slaughter. We had the most powerful man in the country zip-tied and hooded. But as we dragged him toward the roof, I felt the first cold shiver of doubt. This wasn't just an arrest. This was an execution of sovereignty, and the blood on the floor was starting to look a lot like ours. As the Chinook banked hard away from the smoke-choked skyline of Caracas, the interior was silent, save for the heavy breathing of the team and the low whimpering of the hooded figures between us. We had done it. We were winners. But as we crossed into international airspace and the encrypted comms chatter reached a fever pitch, the adrenaline began to clear, replaced by a cold, analytical dread. I adjusted my headset, tuning into the Godview channel, the strategic level frequency usually reserved for the brass. I expected to hear talk of extradition logistics or the legal filing in the Southern District of New York. Instead, I heard the voice of a high-level logistics coordinator speaking to a naval commander on the carrier. The secure zones around the Maracaibo Basin are being designated Green Alpha. Tell the private contractors they have a 48-hour window to establish a perimeter once the interim government signs the decree. We need those well secured before the Russian or Chinese assets can mobilize a response. I froze. My eyes darted to Miller, but he was busy checking a teammate's wound. I kept listening. The narco indictment served its purpose, the voice continued, devoid of any emotion. It gave us the domestic legal cover for the War Powers Act, but the priority shift is now the Orinoco Belt. We can't let the price of crude spike during the transition. The Manhattan court case will be the public circus. The real work starts at the refineries. The world seemed to tilt.
The narco-terrorism narrative, the righteous cause that had seen me through months of grueling training and a night of killing, was the wrapper, not the gift. We hadn't just snatched a criminal, we had cleared the board for a resource grab. The humanitarian crisis we were supposedly solving was being leveraged to ensure that the largest oil reserves on the planet changed management. I looked at Maduro, slumped on the floor of the helicopter. He was a dictator, yes. He was a man who had presided over the collapse of his country. But in that moment, I realized the U.S. government didn't care about the Venezuelan people's freedom any more than he did. We were being used as the most expensive collection agency in human history. Everything I had seen during the setup started to reframe itself with sickening clarity. The Operation Southern Spear buildup wasn't just about air superiority to protect us, it was a blockade. The electronic warfare wasn't just to blind the radars for our entry, it was to paralyze the state's ability to communicate while the interim leaders, handpicked in Washington rooms months ago, took over the oil infrastructure. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the flight. I thought about the 32 dead Cubans and the 20 Venezuelan guards. I thought about my teammate's shattered shoulder. We had bled for a balance sheet. We were told we were heroes protecting the homeland from drugs. The reality was we were corporate raiders in tactical gear. Alpha Lead, confirm HVT vitals for the handover, the command center chimed in. Vital stable, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. Target is secure. I looked out the ramp as we approached the carrier, the massive ship cutting through the Caribbean like a steel island. I realized then that I wasn't a soldier in a crusade. I was a tool in a heist.
The sovereignty of a nation had been dismantled in 30 minutes, not for the sake of international law, but for the sake of a strategic commodity. We weren't the good guys, we were just the most efficient. The handover on the deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford was a surreal, sterile affair. The moment we touched down, a phalanx of federal agents and JAG officers took custody of the prisoners. There were no cheers, no high fives,
just the cold, mechanical efficiency of a system moving to its next phase. Within hours, the images were everywhere. The leader of a sovereign nation, disheveled and defiant, being led into a federal courthouse in Manhattan. The world was screaming. France and the UN issued scathing condemnations, calling the raid a premeditated violation of the UN Charter. But on the ship, the television screen showed something else. The global oil markets were already reacting, and the interim administration in Caracas was already signing emergency energy production agreements. I sat in the debriefing room, my uniform still stained with the dust of Fuerte Tiuna. A colonel I had never seen before stood at the front, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't talk about the men we killed or the sovereignty we shattered. He spoke about geopolitical stabilization and securing the energy corridor. He looked at us and told us we had done our duty. I felt a hollow ache in my chest that no metal could ever fill. We had successfully executed the most daring black op of the century, and yet I felt like I had lost. Back in Venezuela, the fallout was catastrophic. Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president, but the streets were a war zone of mourning and rage. I watched footage of people I was told we were liberating, weeping over the bodies of the guards we had cut down. The narrative back home was a storm of debate over war powers and presidential authority, but for us, the soldiers on the ground, the truth was much simpler.
We had been the blunt instrument used to solve a complex problem of greed and power. I eventually went home, but I couldn't leave the mission behind. Every time I filled up my car, I thought about the marble floors of the palace and the smell of cordite. I thought about the 7 guys on my team who would never be the same. We had captured a dictator, but we had traded our moral standing to do it. We had ignited a fire in South America that would burn for decades, all to ensure that the right people held the keys to the pumps. I stood on my porch one night, looking at the stars, wondering if the world was actually any safer. We were the best in the business, trained to act without hesitation. But for the first time in my career, I wished I had been a second slower. We had changed history, not as liberators, but as the vanguard of a new kind of war, one where the lines between law enforcement and conquest no longer exist. I was a member of the elite, a ghost of the Delta Force, but I realized that in the end, I was just another expendable part of a very large, very hungry machine.